Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to the last Eurofile of 2024. Today, we'll look back at the major stories that shaped 2024 and what we can expect from the year to come. Then we'll be joined by Georgina Wright, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director for International Studies at Institut Montaigne, to discuss the political turmoil currently roiling France. We hope you enjoy the show. Max, what a year.
What a year.
What has stood out to you the most in 2024 for Europe and transatlantic relations?
Well, I'm going to sort of put aside the U.S. election because I think that's the most impactful for 2025. To me, there was a few big events. One, you had the collapse of the French government, or Macron calling for snap elections after the European parliamentary elections that then have led to continued political instability in France. The collapse of the German government, which then will lead to elections in Germany. So I think the kind of sputtering of the Franco-German engine, I think, has been a key feature of 2024. That said, I think when I look at European politics, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag than I think the cliche of just incumbent parties getting hammered and the far right surging. Because in European parliamentary elections, what was produced was a centrist majority in effect. And what we've seen with this new commission is that von der Leyen got a second term and that the European Parliament looks like it can play a real stabilizing and potentially leadership role over the next 4 years. Now, it's going to be a different European Parliament. We saw a lot of machinations over the last month with EPP and Manfred Weber really cajoling and pushing against the socialists and against the Greens. And there's a lot of movement there where the EPP can either move left or it can move right. The brass tacks here is that there is essentially a centrist, if not center-right, majority in the European Parliament that looks like will continue to try to push Europe forward, and particularly on defense policies. So France, Germany, not good. Europe, better.
Yeah, at the EU level, I agree with that. I think at the member state level, I think we can say that it was a bit of an anti-incumbent year, but not so much that it was just a rightward shift. I think that's too simple a picture to paint. We definitely saw this in France after the elections that Macron called in July. Yes, that definitely switched to the right, although mostly in the first round. As we all know, in the second round, it's a more mixed picture. And the left-wing bloc did get quite a bit of seats in the parliament. But in some other places, it's not quite like this. It actually shifted left in Croatia, in Lithuania, in the UK. I know it's not a member state. In Ireland, kind of a mixed picture, although Sinn Féin did quite well. So there's more nuance to the national level elections, but there's a strong anti-incumbent sentiment that still is roiling politics at the European level.
And then I think when it comes to Ukraine, obviously, the most important European security issues, this strikes me as a wasted year for the United States, for Europe, and for Ukraine. If we sort of unpack that, for the U.S., we struggled in the first half of the year in trying to pass a Ukraine supplemental. And then when we did, it was very late and Ukraine lost a lot of ground. And I think the struggle to pass a supplemental, when people talk about the Biden administration not having a strategy, I think that's in some ways accurate and true. But it's largely tied to the money and not knowing how much money you have to spend. And so we are sort of tied in knots on our Ukraine strategy. And I think that was in some ways impacted by Donald Trump and the specter of Trump returning then caused a lot of concern amongst Republicans about whether to support additional funding for Ukraine. And that left the administration stuck with no real strategy of how to kind of ramp up its support for Ukraine when it was seeing North Korea and others potentially do that. But when it comes to Ukraine, there's been a lot of now attention that Ukraine did not mobilize harder and faster in terms of bring younger people to the front lines. And they have now a real manpower crisis. But then it's also about Europe, where the Munich Security Conference was all about, oh my God, Donald Trump may return as president. This could be a crisis. The U.S. hadn't passed aid for Ukraine. Macron, right after the Munich Security Summit, convened leaders in Paris. And the end result was not much. And then there was this big fight over whether to do the Czech initiative and buy ammunition or do what the French wanted, which was to build in Europe. And the end result was like the Czech initiative has sort of worked out and building in Europe has sort of worked out, but there hasn't been anything bold. And this is what really bothers me, is that Europe has had the last year thinking Trump was going to win. And where are the big, bold spending initiatives to really ramp up production? Hasn't really happened. And now Donald Trump is upon not just us, but Ukraine. And now Europe's having the same conversation that it should have had a year ago or 2 years ago.
It was quite preoccupied with itself, too, around discussions leading up to the European Parliament elections, of course. What would a new commission look like? How much power do they have while they're, the caretaker commission? That sucked out so much air. And I think air is kind of the right word when we talk about Europeans talking about Ukraine this past year, is throwing out some ideas without a bold vision leading it. I think part of that is related to the French problem, which is just Macron was really busy with domestic dynamics, and we've seen him be able to be very forward-leaning at other times, and he wasn't able to this time. And Chancellor Scholz was nowhere to be seen on that either, because he had his own problems domestically. So I agree 100%, not a lot was done, despite very well knowing what could come after that. And I think that relates to something that was supposed to be big this year, which was the NATO summit here in Washington to celebrate the anniversary of the alliance. I don't feel like a lot came out of that other than the shiny celebration of the alliance. And maybe there was complacency because it was a Biden administration to just get this done and celebrate and not think about the difficulties.
Yeah, I mean, the summit, it was the 75th anniversary. It was a birthday party. And what we kind of hope is it wasn't a retirement party. And I hope when historians look back at it, they don't say, man, what a missed opportunity. And I think when I think about the Biden administration coming and saying America is back, and that was great. All the good people in the Biden administration want America to be back and to be a strong presence in Europe. But for the past 2 years, it was pretty clear that there was a specter hanging over NATO and hanging over American politics. And that was essentially a lot of the Republican Party and a lot of the American public doesn't want to provide for European security anymore. Doesn't want to do it. Wants to transfer that responsibility over to Europe. Does not want the status quo to remain the case. And NATO thinks Europe is rich enough and wealthy enough to do it, to take care of itself. And the problem is it'll take a long time for that to be the case, given how dependent Europe is on the United States. And to me, this administration needed to begin that transition, and it didn't do it. And that summit was probably the last opportunity to maybe chart an orderly course where the United States plays a role in sort of providing guidance to Europeans about how they can structure their defense without us and begin that transition so that if Trump did win, and he did, then you could say, okay, well, here's the plan that is being implemented about changing roles. And we just wanted to pretend that nothing was going to change. And now what's going to happen is I think the Trump folks will pull out very quickly in 2025 or will do things that will really undermine U.S. support for NATO or shift the equation. And I think this is legitimate. But whether Europe can be cohesive enough in actually responding, I think is a big question. So the United States could have played this key role in, I think, shaping the future of European security. And instead, we've sort of, I think, left Europe believing that we were going to be there. And the Europeans also are not that naive, but then they just wanted to believe that we were going to be there. And that's created, I think, a real problem going forward.
And they don't necessarily have the tools and the political capital, even if they're not naive, to really make the moves that need to happen. We're seeing now, ideas around 500 billion or 500 million, whatever, being thrown out. It's a little late. It's not very sturdy. It's not clear that there's widespread support for such an initiative. Building the capital just didn't happen.
We'll talk more about this on future episodes in the new year because there's going to be a lot of big ideas, good ideas. And I think there are bold ideas out there. The major challenge is that European countries individually kind of suck at defense. And they particularly suck at the European defense. The way European defense does is it works for the United States. So what needs to happen without the United States is European defense integration. That European countries need to not just think about themselves, but how they actually integrate and operate and fight together. And that represents a whole new model, a whole new construct. And it's a real bureaucratic challenge because every single Pentagon, every single Ministry of Defense is like, no, we don't want to change. We don't want to change. We don't want to have to work with them. We don't want to have to buy with them. We don't want to give Brussels more power. Oh my God, God forbid. And then you have NATO being like, we don't like this EU thing. So you're now going to see all these various proposals that are flying around that aren't very coherent. And I think this is where the US could have really been helpful in sort of charting a course. Europe can do this, but the problem is you need European leadership. And it's right now really just in Brussels and maybe in Poland and maybe with Kaja Kallas. But I think you really need the German and French engine to get roaring again. And that's where German elections in 2025 are going to be important.
Yeah, and a couple last things for me for 2024, just looking at the full year, things that I keep my eye on that are still a little bit concerning is just continuing, not just at EU level, but Europe level, concerns around governance and democratic backsliding. We're not seeing a lot of progress there. There's more and more tensions in the Balkans that Brussels is not paying attention to because once again, there is no oxygen for anything else. And I think that's also a wasted year for enlargement, despite despite very big announcements at the beginning of the year, there just doesn't seem to be enough energy for something that is so important. And we saw this starting to also appear at the national level towards the end of the year with the elections in Romania. We're looking at a potentially very serious attack from outside on the election without obviously having a direct impact on the results. That's very hard to say. But on the presidential election for the first round, just a lot of online accounts potentially weighing in on the election, and the first round results were annulled. So we're starting to see just another wave of really concerning dynamics around democracy and governance in Europe.
Yeah, I think maybe to step back for a second, I think one other big thing was the Draghi and Letta report basically laying out a battle plan for Europe economically. And so what I think we see as we enter 2025 is Europe experiencing a real economic stagnation and a challenge to its economic model, number one. And so it has to change. Number two is a real challenge in the fact that the liberal order that Europe was birthed in, the EU literally birthed in this era of new globalization and a rules-based international order, it's going to be really challenged by Trump. And this new era of geopolitical competition means that Europeans, either they stand together or they sink together. And so they really need to be able to operate as Europe and exert European interests to be able to defend Europe. And that means defense. It also means Syria, the collapse of Assad. There's a lot of talk about, now sending Syrian migrants back. That's the first reaction of European politicians. Okay, but maybe you should start by trying to either engage that government, figure out how you can put it on the right course. What do you think about Russian naval bases? Are you going to provide aid? All these other questions before the migration question. It represents a real opportunity, I think, for Europe. But Europe needs to put its geopolitical hat on and start operating more as one. But then we get to your point about Romania. There's going to be a lot of collisions coming with the United States. Tech policy is one. And here's, a case where Europe has passed laws and regulations, the Digital Market and Digital Services Act, about regulating social media companies. And that means collisions with TikTok, collisions with Elon Musk. And we've just seen the power of these platforms to influence public opinion, especially in an era where, I don't know how the kids are getting their news. They're getting it from all different sources, and social media is really important. And the unregulated environment that we have in the United States, you can emulate that. So does Europe want to be like us, or do they want a more controlled media environment? If so, and they've opted for the latter, that's going to lead to confrontation with Washington, and they need to either accept that or bend the knee. And I don't think they're going to want to bend the knee. And that means that they're going to have to take a much stronger approach, both on tech policy, on climate policy, on trade policy. There's going to be a lot of collisions, and on defense. So 2025 is going to be a very interesting year for the Europhile.
Yeah, that's a great pivot. So maybe we can pick a couple things that we're keeping our eye on for 2025. What's on your list?
Well, the German election, I think, is the big thing. It's in end of February. I think that will be incredibly significant for trying to sort of shape the future of Europe. One other thing is that Hungary doesn't have elections in 2025, but in 2026 it does. What happens if Viktor Orban pulls a Georgia? How does the EU respond to that? And I think they got to get ready for a confrontation that may come because Orban's not leading in the polls. And is there going to be free and fair elections in Hungary? I think it's early in 2026. And so I think this is where the EU has to get stronger in all manner, internally, externally. It is going to be challenged in every which way. And so that, I think, is something I'm watching.
Yeah, on my end, definitely the German elections. And then obviously, the elephant in every room is the beginning of the new Trump administration. I think that's where the rubber meets the road, because right now, everything we talk about with the potential for future transatlantic relations is all conjecture. And when they really come into office, we will see what that looks like. There's a new commission in Brussels now. We will see what the engagement will be with the different capitals as well. And we'll start to have tangible things to hang our hat on, as you were talking about, social media, all of this. We won't know until then. I think that's going to be a big transition.
We should say also that the events in Ukraine are going to be, everything.
Yeah, and it'll hit year 3.
Ukraine, it's not a new thing, but it's something that will really dominate how Europe responds on defense, how it responds to the Trump administration. Should there be negotiations? Should the negotiations fail? Should there be no U.S. aid to Ukraine? All have huge implications for Europe, for Europe's fiscal policy. So that will be also everything. And a lot will also depend on what is happening in France. And I think that's a good segue to our guest, Georgina Wright, to tell us what is going on in the French government right now. We are thrilled to welcome Georgina Wright to the Europhile. Georgina is a senior fellow and deputy director for international studies at the Institut Montaigne. She has been analyzing the European Union and wider Europe for over a decade. Her current research focuses on the EU's economic security agenda, EU decision-making, foreign policy, and France's influence inside the EU. She's a member of several expert communities for national governments and regularly advises the EU institutions. Georgina, welcome to the Europhile.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're in Paris, and a lot is happening. We're recording on Friday morning. It's December 13th here in Washington. It's in the afternoon in France. And I believe there's now a new appointed prime minister. Maybe just break it down for us. What has happened over the last week? A government has collapsed. Now a new prime minister is being appointed. Tell us what's going on in Paris.
I'm going to try and be brief because a lot has happened and it's actually sort of predates the fall of the government 2 weeks ago. So I think a bit of context is important. Back in June, we had the European Parliament elections, and the result for that in France was that the Rassemblement National, the far-right party, did very, very well. And Macron's majority did very, very badly. And so Macron saw that result and said, well, the only thing I can do is dissolve the lower assembly, so parliament, and call for new, fresh elections, because I've heard the French and they're unhappy and they don't like the majority. And so we should have a parliament that is more kind of respectful and reflective of current political mood. He didn't have to do that. He chose to do that. Now, the result of that is that before the dissolution, he had a relative majority. And then after the dissolution, he had no majority at all. And it was a hung parliament, which in France is very complicated because there's just not this culture of compromise. And so when he appointed a new prime minister and the new government, he took forever to actually find someone who would do the job. And there was this whole question about, should he pick someone for the far right, Le Rassemblement National? They were the largest party in the lower assembly. They're still the largest party. Or should he appoint someone from the left-wing coalition? So if you took all the left-wing, centre-left and left-wing parties, they were the biggest bloc in the parliament. He didn't go for either. He ended up going for Michel Barnier, who was a former minister and also perhaps known in Washington as the Brexit negotiator. And he thought, if someone can find a compromise with the UK and 27 EU countries and several EU institutions, surely he'll be able to find a compromise for, national laws and get them through Parliament.
So you're saying French politics is more difficult than EU politics?
Well, perhaps as complicated is what I would say. But anyway, Michel Barnier really tried to do that, but the crunch point was the budget. He simply couldn't get enough majority support to get that through and faced a no confidence vote. And so the government fell. And now there really is a kind of race until the end of the year to appoint a new prime minister so that this person and this new government can get some form of budget through until the end of the year. Otherwise, we would be exposed to something, is well known in the US, which is a shutdown, but is very uncommon in France. So that's where we are. And now President Macron has appointed someone, François Bayrou, who hopefully can get the budget through and can hold a government through at least until next summer, which is when Macron could dissolve parliament again and call for fresh elections.
What does a shutdown look like, just for us to understand the consequences for France and its economy?
So it's a very good question, also because it doesn't really happen. And there are actually constitutional provisions that can prevent that from happening. But it would look pretty much like it would in the US, which means that the public sector would go without any funding, right? So you're talking about government departments that can't function. You're thinking about doctors and nurses that can't function. I mean, a whole sway of the whole public sector, essentially, that can't continue. But as I said, there are constitutional provisions that, make that very unlikely. The first thing is that the new government could pass special legislation, which would enable the government to kind of use exactly the same budget as 2024. So at least you can run that over into 2025, which would allow more time to kind of put a new proposal on the table and negotiate it in Parliament and get it adopted. And if that failed, then the president could himself take emergency measures to get a budget through as well. So there are kind of constitutional provisions that would prevent that. But essentially, we'd be looking at a situation pretty similar to what we have in the US.
Just on that, I mean, that strikes me as sort of the obvious thing. I mean, in the US, the way the congressional budgeting works is a lot of the time, they are just passing what we call continuing resolutions here, where They can't really agree on a big budget. They're just kicking the can on a budget negotiation. We're about to probably have that right now in our Congress. We'll pass a continuing resolution. And then maybe just to provide a little bit color on our shutdowns. I mean, they're very clarifying politically, actually, and they happen sort of once a decade, usually. Most government functions sort of continue because they're sort of designated emergency, but then those that are kind of special, most, passport services, other things like that, stop. And then everyone gets pissed. Businesses get annoyed because their permits aren't getting approved. And so this furor builds up. And our history has been Republicans usually pay a price for shutting down the government. And I'm curious if there is sort of a government chaos. Who would pay the price? I mean, is that known? I mean, it would be Macron. I mean, he's not up for election. Would it be bad for Le Pen and the National Rally? How do you think the politics of this will play out if there is sort of real budgetary chaos?
So I'm going to say that the reason why Parliament voted down Barnier's government is because they knew there were provisions in place that would allow some form of provisional budget to be adopted and for a shutdown to be avoided. And therefore, if you were the Rassemblement National or the left-wing coalition, their sort of argument was, we can't possibly agree to Barnier's budget because it's not in line with what voters expect from us, and therefore we're voting down the government. And then that means that we now have a new government. They'll probably vote favourably to these special provisions and then allow a new, fresh negotiations for a new budget in the new year. And so they're kind of saved from that. I think had those special provisions not been in place, then it would have looked very differently, as you just said, because you could blame those parties that voted down the government. The majority coalition that was supporting the government could say, well, wait, we did everything we could to prevent this from happening, and it's the fault of the opposition. But I think the question of Macron in all of this is really important because he gave a big speech, not as long as many people expected him. He's known to sort of give very long speeches, but he, came on French television and he basically sort of blamed the parliament, right? And he said there was no reason to vote down the government. The government tried everything that they could to find a compromise and still that wasn't possible. And this is, really bad just before Christmas. They're putting the whole of France in a very tricky political situation. And so in a sense, a lot of people kind of saw that and said, well, wait a minute, you chose to dissolve Parliament on the back of the European Parliament elections. You didn't have to do that. You chose to do it. If we ended up in a hung Parliament, that's because of your decision making. So I think there's a lot of blame game and pointing the finger at everyone. And I think fundamentally what's really important to remember is everyone has the eye on 2027, right? And so who's going to be the next person in the Élysée Palace? Who's Macron going to hand over the presidential keys to? If you take that prism, then you'll see everything that the political parties are doing as astutely trying to position themselves for that. So it's going to be a lot of more blame game, I think, for the next couple of years.
It's crazy to think we're just about halfway through Macron's second term. It feels like 4. It's just been a lot going on. I'm curious how you gauge his appointment of François Bayrou as the prime minister, because I couldn't understand on the left the real disappointment and anger when he picked Barnier, because the National Rally was the largest party, but the NFP was the largest coalition or bloc that really showed up together for the election, and he didn't pick anyone from there. He refused multiple people. And this time around, it feels like it's something similar. He didn't really want to consider anybody from the left that we know of. So are they likely on the NFP side to be a little more amenable to someone like Bayrou? He is in the middle. For people who don't know, he's from the centrist party that got behind Macron really quickly the first time around. So how do you gauge his ability to potentially rally more people from the left than Barnier could have?
It's going to be extremely difficult, right? I think there are lots of rumors as to why Macron picked François Bayrou or Bayrou. It depends who you listen to, where they're from in France and how they pronounce his surname. But he, from everything that I've heard and that what we're reading also in the press is that François Bayrou doesn't appear to have been Macron's first choice. And so you have Jean-Yves Le Drian, former Foreign Secretary and Defense Secretary, who publicly said, I was asked whether I wanted to do it and I said no. So that seemingly shows that there were other candidates. And then the rumour also goes that François Bayrou got a call from the president. President said to him, I'm not going to pick you as Prime Minister. And he said, if you don't pick me or someone from my party, then we're going to remove our support from the next government and we'll leave the coalition of the majority, the coalition around Macron. And so it might have been something like that. But, it's very difficult to say because obviously we're not privy to those conversations. But on your question, your more fundamental question, which is, can he do a better job than Barnier? Well, at the moment, it feels like a sense of déjà vu where you've got Jordan Bardella, who's like the head of the Rassemblement National, who said, we won't necessarily vote the government down, but we'll have to see what the government has to put forward. Le Pen, who's already said this is just a rerun. So exactly the same as we had back in with Barnier. You've got the left-wing coalition splintered. They seem to have said we won't vote the government down if the government chooses not to use Article 49, which is basically 49.3, so 49.3. It's an article in the Constitution which allows the government to basically ram through legislation without a vote. And the left-wing coalition has said if the government says that it will not use that, i.e. on every piece of legislation there will be a vote, we will then not vote down the government. So it's going to be all about this, but there's a real sense of déjà vu. And as you said, François Bayrou is a centrist. He's from the centre-right. He's well known in the French public. Michel Barnier was not well known. François Bayrou is. He, was a figure under Sarkozy and a number of other recent sort of centre-right governments, Edouard Philippe. So people either like him or they don't, but at least they know him. And the way he speaks and the way he talks, I think he might cut through. But, the jury is out on whether he will do a better job than Barnier.
I've seen him on TV since I was a kid. He doesn't strike me as a super confrontational figure. It might be that in more recent years, kind of in the shadow of Macron, he has moderated himself. But I feel like out of all the ones that he could have picked, even sometimes how Barnier can be, Bayrou can be a little more palatable. But I guess we'll see.
The difficulty with Bayrou is that some people think that he thinks he was le faiseur de roi. That means that the only reason why Macron won in 2017 is because Bayrou was running to become president and then came out of the race, pulled out of the race and backed Macron. And a lot of time his entourage say, well, Bayrou did that and that's what led to Macron's election, so that Macron owes him rather than Bayrou owing Macron. And so the sense is, how will that dynamic work out? Will Bayrou put his foot down when he thinks that what Macron's asking him to do is wrong, or will he not? But at the end of the day, he's still from that, coalition around Macron. So for a lot of people, they'll put them in the same basket.
Maybe let's take a step back and sort of, what does this mean for France going forward for the 2027 election? And then also I want to sort of pivot what this means for Europe, because, America's very used to political gridlock and deadlock in Congress and not being able to get anything done. And basically there's no hope of passing any legislation. I mean, that's basically every American president's after their first 2 years in office. That's their second 2 years in office. For many, it's, 6 of their 8 years in office is not really having a workable parliament. What do you think this means for France when it comes to just sort of governing? But then maybe also for 2027, can we pull any direction from where things might go? It seems like from the European Parliament elections, also from Macron's last election, that there's a solid 60% of the French public against the far right. The 60% isn't really for each other, but they're kind of against the far right. And I guess the danger here is that you just sort of see a total splintering of French politics, I would think, where the two candidates, France has sort of a jungle first round, the second round is the final two, and the final two being the far left and the far right. And that's how you could probably see the far right winning. And that's kind of how I see it. Two sort of big questions there for you.
I think that your reading is largely right on the second point. So on the first point, the French system is a bit different from the US system in that you have a president and then you have a prime minister who heads a government. And, the president is there to présider. So he has a lot of kind of decision-making power over foreign policy in particular, but he's the head of state. And then you have a prime minister who's the head of government. And that the government is supposed to be putting forward legislation proposals on all these different other things like health and fiscal spending and everything like that. So they are supposed to be decorrelated. Now, in practice, in the early 2000s, there was reforms that said, okay, we're going to now reduce the presidential mandate from 7 to 5 years, and we're going to hold the presidential election and then within a couple of months hold the parliamentary elections. So they were more in sync. Now, in practice, what that's meant is that usually when you have a new president, then the majority in parliament will often be tended to be kind of a majority for the president. And so those mandates have become much closer and there's been much more proximity between the president and the prime minister. But one of the big criticisms of Macron is that he's trying to be president and prime minister. Right, he's trying to kind of direct everything from health policy to education to everything else. And sort of the role of the prime minister has diminished as a consequence. So in a way, I think we have had in the past experience of a president and then a prime minister from a different party working together. But since those reforms in the early 2000s, it's been basically the president, and the prime minister have to get along, and the president's much more involved in the work of the government. So it is different to the US system, I think, to a certain extent. The jury is out on how it would play out in the future. On 2027, I think you're right to say that if Macron won a second mandate, it's not necessarily because the French loved him, but because they disliked Marine Le Pen more, right? There was a majority of French people who didn't want the far right in power. So the whole game, I think, for the far right has been to use these years to convince a majority of French people that they can be trusted to have the keys of the presidential palace. And how you do that, well, you look professional. It was quite interesting, wasn't it? When after the legislative elections in July, the first day of the new parliament, here come the far right. They're all dressed in suits. They're talking about everything they're going to do. They're going to try and work with the government, but they're going to see what's possible. That there's a real sense of presenting themselves as I don't want to say mainstream because it doesn't really mean anything nowadays, but at least as a party that is credible, that has ideas and that could be put in a position of power. And so, how much they're able to do that and how much they can convince basically a majority of French people to back them, we'll have to see. Because in the parliamentary elections, I'm not going to go into how MPs are voted, but it's very difficult for the far right to get into power because you've got this Republican front. Usually it's two candidates. And if you don't want the far right in, you'll just vote for whoever else is opposite. In a presidential election, it's proportional representation. And that was what was remarkable in the last parliamentary elections. The far right didn't have a majority, but they certainly were the party that had the most seats. But the coalitions and everything else, there were larger coalitions on the left. So if you think that the presidential system is based on proportional voting, then all they have to do is convince a majority of French people to give them a shot. And so that will be as much as what they can do and how badly other parties do in the next couple of years.
Yeah, it hadn't occurred to me, but if Le Pen, let's just say, were to win the 2027 because the far left and the far right become the top two parties, if you had a parliamentary election, I think we would be back where we are right now, right, in France, where it would seem like divided government then would become a feature, as there would probably be a parliamentary backlash to having her as president. But then, Etienne, why don't you go ahead?
I was just going to note that also we saw the general trend, and Georgina, please correct me if that's wrong, but from what I saw after the election in July was that, yes, there is a Republican front, but it's a little sturdier on the left than it is on the right, because in precincts or districts, whatever we want to call them in English, where there are two candidates, one far right, one not, the right-wing voters tended to be more open to the right-wing candidate than a lot of the left-wing voters really were that barrage against the far right. And these numbers on the right have just slowly been decreasing, the number of people who are okay being that Republican front. So if that trend just keeps going, you can see a world in which these right-wing voters have been sufficiently convinced, not just that the far right is palatable, but that the far left is more concerning, because that came up in exit polls as well, that people were more worried about someone like Mélenchon than they were about someone like Bardella.
I think that's right. And there are the two things to note. One is abstention is on the rise. France is a country that's always had so much pride in the fact that people turn out and vote. It's not compulsory to vote, but everyone turns out to vote. Well, actually, when you look at numbers, and that's what was interesting in the last election, is that it went up again. But it is overall on decrease. And the second thing to note is the young are much more willing to vote extreme, whether it's far right or far left. Whereas the older generations tend to really still want to block out these, and particularly the far right, this cordon sanitaire, this Republican front. I think if it worked in the last parliamentary elections and it worked in the last presidential election, it's also because older people will simply refuse to have the far right in power. I simply don't think that's the case with younger people anymore. The World War II is very far away. And also they feel that these parties, why not give them an opportunity? I mean, I've got nothing to lose, my prospects don't look as bright as they used to. So I think the generational gap is going to be really interesting and something to follow in the next elections.
Maybe just lastly, what does this mean for Europe? It seems like France is going to be a bit of a political mess for the next few years. What do you think the implications are for the EU we just had an election here in the United States. We're about to have a new Trump administration. How do you think this is going to impact the EU's ability to both respond to the United States, reform itself because of the economic situation within the EU? What does this mean for Europe?
Really good question. I mean, Macron, during his very first campaign, kind of put Europe front and center of his campaign, saying that a strong Europe makes for a strong France. And I think if you look at how much the EU has evolved over the past 7-8 years, it feels like the EU has never been more French. It's talking about, I don't want to talk about strategic autonomy, but basically you have an EU that's saying we need to work with the United States, but we should be able to act alone and do more by ourselves if we can't. And that's like terribly French. It's been, something the France has been saying for that forever. They're talking about industrial policy, like what do we need to do to make sure that we're good on innovation, that we have innovation-led productivity. How do we think about competitiveness? How do we position ourselves vis-a-vis, US-China rivalry? Like there are lots of questions where it feels like the conversation has never been more French. But that said, it's very difficult to get anything done inside the EU unless you have a well-functioning France and a well-functioning Germany. And at the moment, both are sort of in paralysis. We have elections in Germany in February that could see a new coalition, but led by the CDU, so the centre-right party. And we know that von der Leyen, so the president of the Commission, comes from that party. We know that the CDU have a majority in the European Parliament. So we could see a Germany that's much more influential come March than France, particularly if Macron is, constantly sucked up by all the political domestic problems and turmoil, and particularly if we have a French government that fails to get anything through. Because one of the criticisms that other member states have of France is you talk and you talk, you have lots of ideas, but actually you're not able to bring down your debt, which is a huge problem for the Eurozone. Like there's lots of criticisms on what France is actually able to do. And if you have a France that's completely consumed domestically by its political turmoil, then it's very difficult to see how a France can respond to those two big concerns, which is bring your debt down and spend more, particularly on defence. So, it could really, I think, impact France's overall influence inside the EU at a time when the EU has never been more French.
It's typical France that the moment they win the argument, they're too much of a mess to then take advantage of it. Georgina Wright, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for joining us on a Friday afternoon. It's been a real treat to have you.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producer, Shannon Young, and to Otto Svensson and Essie Pekkanen for coordinating and researching this episode and for all the great work they've done over this past year. We'll be back soon in the new year with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. It's going to be a fun and interesting year. Until next time.